Syracuse football doesn't have to play the big boys in the ACC next season, but it's still not going to be easy for the Orange.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. On today's show, we are going over Syracuse football's ACC schedule, talking about how there's no Clemson, no FSU, no top 3 quarterback in the NFL draft they're going to have to face. That's a good thing, and that's also a bad thing. It's kind of conflicting. I'll go over that. At NC State and Miami are the toughest games in the ACC schedule this season for Syracuse, and Georgia Tech at home in week 2 is going to set the tone for the Cuse this season. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So before we get into why not having Clemson, FSU, and a top 3 quarterback is good and bad for Syracuse, let's first talk about the ACC schedule. Starting off with Georgia Tech on September 7th at noon. Then there's Stanford on September 20th at 7:30. Then there's at NC State on October 12th. That time has not been announced. At Pitt on October 24th. That game's at 7:30. Virginia Tech on November 2nd. That time has not been announced. At Boston College on November 9th. That time has not been announced. At Cal on November 16th. That time has not been announced. And Miami to close the regular season finale on November 30th. Time still has not been announced for that one, but there's still plenty of time to actually tell us when that game will be. Now let's get into why it's a good thing and a bad thing that Clemson, Florida State, and a top 3 quarterback like a UNC, which is what I'm referring to regarding Drake May last season, not having them on the schedule is a good thing and a bad thing for Syracuse. Here's why it's good. Okay, this is why it's a good thing. I think we all know the obvious, right? Clemson and FSU are the 2 best teams in the ACC. FanDuel right now has them as the biggest favorites to win the conference next year. Florida State, I believe, is the favorite at plus 270. Clemson right behind them at plus 390. The 2 best teams in the ACC are Clemson and Florida State. They are not on Syracuse's schedule. Obviously, any team can be beat on any particular day within the conference, right? Upsets do happen, and Syracuse did beat Clemson in an upset at home in 2017. That happened. Clemson was, I believe, the number 2 team in the country when that happened, and they beat them. But still, it almost feels like a circled loss when you got a Florida State and you got a Clemson on the schedule. Syracuse is 2-10 versus Clemson lifetime. They're 2-14 against FSU lifetime. They just don't really beat those teams that often. They're the 2 classes of the conference. So it's a good thing in that sense that they're not on the schedule. And regarding UNC, I'm referring to the fact that Syracuse is probably not going to have to face a quarterback that's going to go top 3 in the NFL draft next season. When they played UNC, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, UNC has some pretty good players, and they're definitely more talented than Syracuse. But let's just be completely honest. If UNC had a mediocre quarterback, they would be a mediocre team. Okay, Drake May was just that good, and Syracuse had no answer for Drake May last season. So they're not going to have to face a quarterback that's as talented as Drake May in the ACC next season. They don't. And there aren't many that are as talented as Drake May in college. So that's why. Regarding why it's bad, here's why it's bad that those type of teams are not on Syracuse football's schedule for next season. This means, and I referred to this last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever I said that an insider called Syracuse a Cinderella or a sleeper to make the college football playoff. Well, not having those teams makes the schedule for Syracuse weaker. The Orange have the easiest schedule of all the Power 4 teams next season. They have it. I believe the ranking was provided from ESPN Index, but it said that Syracuse had the easiest schedule in part because you don't have Clemson and you don't have Florida State, and you're not going to face a team that has a top 3 NFL draft pick at quarterback. With the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams, after the automatic qualifiers, which are the conference winners and the one group of 5 team, that's when a lot of debate is going to be had. See, a lot of times when we think tournament expansion, we think that it'll eliminate the arguments. When in fact, it does the opposite. It creates more arguments because you are expanding the pool. When you have a 4-team playoff, last year, one team got quote unquote screwed in Florida State. And that's a whole separate issue of whether or not they deserve to get in or not. And you could make the argument that Georgia should have gotten in based on just being one of the 4 most talented teams in the country last year. But that was it. Those are the only 2 teams that had the argument. But next season, when this playoff goes to 12 teams, we're going to be having debates between 10-2 ACC versus 9-3 SEC, 8-4 SEC, 9-3 Big Ten versus 9-3 SEC. You get the idea. There's going to be all these debates between teams with similar records in different conferences. And unfortunately, the ACC in football is not held to a super high standard, or not as held in high regard as the SEC or the Big Ten. The ACC kind of is like a second or third fiddle to any of those conferences. And so if Syracuse finds itself in a position where it can make the playoff next season, they go 10-2. But as I'm going to get to in the next segment, they don't beat NC State. They don't beat Miami. And they didn't have to face Clemson. They didn't have to face Florida State. And those teams also go in the neighborhood of 10-2, 9-3. All of a sudden, Syracuse with 10 wins or 9 wins to get into the playoff, the case just doesn't look as strong because you didn't have to face the class of your conference. That's what I'm trying to get out here. So it's a good thing that they don't have to face them, because if they did, they probably lose, even though it's possible you can eke out an upset. But the fact that they don't have them on the schedule works against them because it makes it weaker. And if they run into a scenario with the college football playoff against these other teams, those other teams might have a better case for it because they had to play against tougher competition. So, yes, it's good. And it's also bad that Clemson, Florida State, and a top 3 NFL draft pick at quarterback are not on the schedule for the Orange next season. Now, coming up, the 2 toughest games for Syracuse football in the ACC next year have got to be at NC State and Miami at home. It's one thing to watch baseball on TV. That times can get boring, but going to a game in person is an awesome experience. And I'm looking forward to actually watching the Mets this summer because they're starting to get hot. It's unbelievable. They're actually starting to win baseball games. And the way I'm going to be purchasing tickets is through Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. One game that I'm thinking about attending is Mets-Astros in New York on June 28th. I can get in for as little as $26. All you got to do for your team of your choosing, whatever you want to do, is go to Gametime and search up that team, and the ticket options will appear for you right away. And my favorite part is the all-in pricing feature. Toggling this feature shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the streaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we are going over Syracuse football's ACC schedule for next season. We just talked about how not having Clemson or Florida State or a team with a top 3 NFL draft prospect at quarterback, why it's a good thing that those teams are not on the schedule and why it's a bad thing that those teams are not on the schedule. And now it's time to talk about the 2 toughest games in the ACC for the Orange next season. And they undoubtedly, in my opinion, have got to be at NC State and Miami at home. Let's start off with at NC State. This team is ranked 13th right now. They are ranked 13th in the country on the ESPN post-spring rankings. 13th. So they're pretty good. They have a new starting quarterback in Grayson McCall, but he is a 4-star transfer from Coastal Carolina. If you recall my debate with Tyler Budge about Kyle McCord versus Grayson McCall, I would take Kyle McCord, but it's possible that Grayson McCall could have a better year. It's just that one's more proven than the other. I trust Kyle McCord a little bit more. Returning the ACC Rookie of the Year last year in KC Concepcion. So they got a new transfer quarterback. They're returning a top wide receiver from last season. Since their head coach, Dave Doran, took over in 2013, NC State has qualified for a bowl in 9 of 11 seasons. They are an underrated program across the country. I don't think many people really pay attention to NC State nationally regarding football, really. NC State's just one of those programs that's just consistently been pretty good over the last few seasons, and they project to be good once again for next season. Maybe they are a sleeper for the college football playoff next year. So the fact that Syracuse is going to have to go on the road and play NC State, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's a circled loss. I don't think they have a circled loss on the schedule. Those are reserved for Clemson and Florida State, really. They could beat NC State on the road, but I wouldn't bet that. I would say that NC State is probably going to win that game. It's just not you shouldn't get totally annihilated by them, okay? Let's just not get totally annihilated by NC State. But it's going to be a tough game, nevertheless. Tough game there. And then there is Miami at home, which is the regular season finale. They are currently ranked 24th in the country on the ESPN post-spring rankings. They also have a new starting quarterback in a 4-star transfer, Cam Ward from Washington State. He is an NFL draft prospect. I don't think he's on the Drake May level, which was a top 3 pick in the NFL draft. But still, you never know. I have an example right here that I wrote down, which is that I remember when Joe Burrow was considered like a mid-round quarterback prospect for LSU entering the season, and then all of a sudden he won the Heisman and became the number 1 pick in the NFL draft, and the rest is history regarding Joe Burrow. So I'm not saying Cam Ward's going to have a Joe Burrow type season, but at the same time, it's early and you never know. I know I said earlier that they don't have to face anyone on the level of Drake May. Maybe Cam Ward proves me wrong and has a big year. So totally possible there. They also returned ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year defensive end Ruben Bain Jr. Miami always gets strong recruiting classes, strong transfer portal classes. They are never an easy out for anybody, but they are also that type of team that underachieves every single year, and I think they're going to underachieve again. And it's because they have a moron at head coach in Mario Cristobal. He's just an idiot. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I've seen him. When I saw him not call a kneel in that game against Georgia Tech last season at home, and then Georgia Tech won the game. If you haven't seen that video, Go look it up. Miami, all they had to do is kneel to win the game. They didn't. They ran it. They fumbled. Georgia Tech recovers and then scores to win the game. That's Mario Cristobal as a head coach. So I think what gives me comfort in this game is the fact that it's at home and Mario Cristobal is the head coach of Miami, because otherwise Miami is that type of team that has really, really strong athletes on the roster. They have athletes that are just, quite frankly, better than Syracuse's athletes. And sometimes it's just about the Jimmies and Joes. That's just sometimes what it is. I remember there was one year where Syracuse played Florida State. It was at home. It might have been in the 2022 season. And Syracuse had obviously gotten out to a hot start. I want to say they were both 6-3, or Syracuse might have been one game better than Florida State, but Florida State completely annihilated them in Syracuse's building. It was a couple of years ago. And it was in large part because, well, Florida State just simply has better athletes, even though the records might be identical. So Syracuse in games where they're going against a team with better athletes, it doesn't typically end well. Having said that, Miami, they underachieve every single year because they have a moron of a head coach. And also, well, the game's at home. So you never know. Syracuse can certainly beat Miami. It's just going to probably be an uphill battle for Syracuse. So in total, I would say the goal for Syracuse here is to split these two games. So go 1-1 and hopefully no blowouts. You want to look pretty for the committee. I don't know what else to tell you. If Syracuse finds itself in a college football playoff scenario where they might have a chance of making it, it's not going to look good if you got blown out by Miami and or NC State. So don't get blown out. Hopefully you can steal one of those games and put yourself in a conversation for either a high bowl game or the college football playoff. Now coming up, Georgia Tech at home week 2 is going to set the tone for this team next season. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we're going over Syracuse football's ACC schedule for next season. We talked about earlier not having Clemson, Florida State, top 3 quarterback, why it's good and why it's bad that they're not on the schedule. At NC State and Miami are the toughest games for Syracuse next season. And now it's time to discuss why Georgia Tech at home sets the tone for the rest of the season for the Orange next year. First of all, Georgia Tech is a pretty decent team. They're pretty decent. Haynes King is a very solid quarterback in the ACC. Last year, he had 37 total touchdowns. 37. Now, he did throw 16 interceptions, so you know he's going to give you 1 or 2 per game if you just get your hands on it. But at the same time, talented quarterback, pretty solid team. Georgia Tech last year made a bowl game for the first time since 2018. That was under Brent Key in his first full season as the head coach of Georgia Tech. He took over the year before midseason. Here's why this game, though, sets the tone for Syracuse for the whole year. Not saying that it's going to, if they lose, that we have to panic or anything, but it really is going to set the tone. It's going to give us a feel for how good or how bad the Orange are next season. First of all, you start with Ohio at home. I spoke about this earlier in the week. Ohio at home, you're probably going to beat Ohio at home. They're currently 15.5-point favorites. It would be really disappointing if they lost that game, and if they did lose that game, I would tell you to panic. I don't think they will, and I think they'll probably cover 15.5. I'm being completely honest with you. I think they will beat them pretty good. But again, it's Ohio, right? It doesn't really matter. Georgia Tech is an ACC team with a talented quarterback, as I just mentioned. That was a bowl team last year in week 2. in week 2. And it really reminds me of when Syracuse opened the season a couple years ago against Louisville in the Dome. If you recall, they also had a talented quarterback coming in Malik Cunningham. That was a pretty hyped up game. I think before the game, many people thought it could go either way. I think Louisville might have been considered the team with more talent, but Syracuse was at home. I don't remember the exact line on the game, but it was definitely close. And Syracuse annihilated them, just annihilated Louisville at home to open the season. I remember that set the tone for a really strong first half. I remember that game so vividly. The most vivid part of it was the Derek McDonald interception at the end of the third quarter. It was on a long third down. And I love third down interceptions. Sorry, I'm going on a brief little tangent here. But I love third down turnovers when the team that we cheer for obviously forces it. Because on third down, the crowd gets super hyped, right? It's third down. You can get out the field. And then there's that explosion when you actually cause a turnover on third down or you get the sack. It's just a great feeling. So I remember jumping out of my seat when Derek McDonald got the interception. It was on 3rd and 15, I want to say, and it set Syracuse up for a red zone opportunity. They scored on it, and the rest was history for that game. They just blew them out. They blew out Louisville. So that was just really a long way of me telling you that game really set the tone for the first half of the season for Syracuse in 2022. Now, unfortunately, the wheels fell off 3 quarters through Clemson. That's when it fell off on one penalty. But who knows, right? Who knows what would have happened if that penalty didn't happen that way. But the point being is that we had an idea of how good or how bad Syracuse was based on the fact that they crushed Louisville in week 1. And Louisville was a good team that year. So similar with Syracuse this season and Georgia Tech. If Syracuse gets blown out against Georgia Tech, that's a problem. If Syracuse blows out Georgia Tech, man, we got to be feeling pretty good for the rest of the season. And if it's anything in between, well, maybe Syracuse will be an 8-win team, 9-win team. Maybe they'll be a 6 or 7-win team. We won't necessarily know. But the point being is that game could very well set the tone for the rest of the season for Syracuse next year. So that's why Georgia Tech is important. Regarding now the overall ACC, as far as a record prediction, I am going to say 4-4 in the ACC next season for Syracuse. It is identical to 2022. I could see an upside of 6-2 in the conference. I just don't know. I just don't think that the Orange could run the table in the ACC next year. I would love to see it. I'm rooting for Syracuse. I just don't think they're going to go 8-0 in the conference or 7-1 in the conference. I think 6-2 is the upside, and I would say the downside is 3-5. I think because, spoiler alert to Paul Friday, they're probably going to win at least 3 games in non-conference play. So I think if you win 3 games in non-conference, they're probably going to find a way to at least get 3 in the ACC to qualify for a bowl game. I'm basically telling you that the downside for this team next year, what feels like the first time in many years, the downside is they win 6 games and they make a bowl. When was the last time we could say that, right? Heading into a year, when was the last time we could say the worst case scenario for this team is probably 6 wins? And they have the upside of a team that could win 10 games just like it did in 2018. So overall, it's not a brutal ACC schedule, right? Not having the big dogs on there. But at the same time, I don't see the Orange running the table, dominating the ACC. I just don't see it. 4-4 is my record prediction for Syracuse football. Hope I'm wrong in a good way. 5-3, 6-2, 7-1, 8-0. That's what I mean by that. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, click that like button. If you really liked it, subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you know right away when I'm dropping the next podcast. Tomorrow, we'll go over the overall schedule takeaways for Syracuse football next season. It could be a special one. How many wins will Syracuse football get?